and we are good on the Facebook Live as well.
Great. Good evening. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. It's great to see you all here on this Tuesday night. We've got some snow where I am in Philadelphia, and I know all around the state, so hope everyone is nice and warm. So we are here tonight to talk about the Equal Rights Amendment. And before we get started, I wanted to just share a couple of quick housekeeping things. For your awareness, this webinar is being recorded, but as it is a webinar, your camera is turned off, so you don't need to worry about your face being included in the recording. A quick reminder that closed captioning is available in Zoom. To enable closed captions in your screen, just click Live Transcript in your Zoom taskbar. And if you need more assistance with closed captioning or anything else regarding accessibility, please let us know in the chat. We'll begin our time together with a land acknowledgement. And I don't have the land acknowledgement in my script. While we pull that up, let me tell you a little bit about the League of Women Voters. So we are a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization. Our state office oversees a grassroots network of over 31 local leagues that exist all across Pennsylvania. And as an organization, we encourage informed and active participation in government. We work to increase understanding of major public policy issues, and we influence public policy through education and advocacy. To learn more about our work or to subscribe to our action alerts, please visit our website, and we are happy to also drop those links in the chat. So now I'll begin with our land acknowledgement. Colonial Pennsylvania boundaries were first drawn in 1681 over original nations' lands. We in Pennsylvania acknowledge the land ownership of original indigenous peoples, honoring the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and the great nations of Pennsylvania: Erie, Iroquois, Muncie, Delaware, Shawnee, Ohio Valley, Susquehannock, and Lenape. We honor all original nations of the past and those among us today. So let's get started. I'm so excited to kick off our discussion about the role the League of Women Voters can play in passing and instituting the Equal Rights Amendment. This evening, we'll discuss the history of the Equal Rights Amendment, what the implications for its ratification have meant, and what PA voters and League members can do to advance this important amendment. A big thank you to the League's Social Policy Director, Susan Bozer, and her committee for their support of this event. I'm pleased to now introduce our guest speaker, AJ Conroy. AJ is an attorney practicing in Illinois. She manages social media and special events for the ERA of Illinois, a statewide coalition for the Equal Rights Amendment. During the Illinois campaign for ratification, her favorite project was creating Equal, a coloring book, which was distributed around the state. Currently, AJ coordinates the State Law Audit Project, an initiative of the ERA Coalition. So she is certainly an expert in this issue area. AJ, I'll turn it over to you to begin your presentation. And we might just need a minute to get our slides up. Just 1 second.
No problem. Thank you so much, Meg. Hello, friends in Pennsylvania, friends of equality. I'm really excited to be talking to you today about one of my favorite subjects. So first, I'm going to introduce myself quickly, and if you can go to the next slide. This is me. My name is AJ Conroy, and you can go to the next slide, please. I am an attorney, and this is the part where I have to say, while I am an attorney, I'm not your attorney, so everything I say is not legal advice. That's the caveat we're always supposed to give, right? But the reason that I'm going to be talking to you today is in my role coordinating the State Law Audit Project for the ERA Coalition. And if you can go to the next slide, the ERA Coalition is a group of organizations dedicated to constitutional equality. And I will tell you a little bit more about what we're doing on that in future slides. But if you could go to the next slide, I'm going to give you a roadmap. We're going to talk about history, give you a little story time, and then we're going to talk about the current state of the Equal Rights Amendment, and I'm going to dive into the purpose, why so many people are working for so many years on this issue, what is it for, and then we're going to end with a call to action, right? Because that's what we are as leaguers. I should add, I'm also, in addition to the many hats that we all wear, right, I'm also active with my League of Women Voters of Park Ridge. So if we can go to the next slide and start with our history, our story time. So this is Alice Paul, and she is amazing. You're probably aware of her from your suffrage centennial activities from a few years ago. She's amazing. Here she is, 100% working it in terms of messaging. So if you take this photo that is pretty famous of her, she is standing in front of this flag that she sewed. So every time there was a ratification, sewed on the star. So like really leaning into the, still feminine arts, right? And she's holding up a cocktail because opponents at the time were saying that a vote for suffrage was a vote for prohibition. And there she is, like sort of countering all that message. So she's a marketing genius, and I so admire everything she did for suffrage. But really, what I key in for her, if you can go to the next slide, this is the Alice Paul that I think of. So this is the woman who worked for 50 years on the Equal Rights Amendment. Got a law degree double time by going to night school at one law school and day in the other, and just was constantly looking for ways to elevate gender equality in our Constitution. So if I, that's okay. But if I continue to tell the story of only Alice Paul and the Equal Rights Amendment is the sprained child of Alice Paul, then we're sort of subscribing to the great man theory of history. And we know that movements that's not what movements are. Movements, real things happen because of multiple unsung people all over the country, all working on the same. So if I tell the story of the equal rights with just a few people, then I don't get to tell you about, for example, Mary Church Terrell, one of the many women who worked on the Equal Rights Amendment. So she also was active in suffrage, very active in desegregation efforts in D.C. And here is a quote of her. She spoke to Congress about the Equal Rights Amendment in 1948. And people don't remember that in 1948, the Equal Rights Amendment was really close to passing out of Congress. And it makes you think, like, what would our country be like if we had been able to ratify in the 50s? It's just kind of mind-boggling. But the lesson that I'm going to tease out to you when I'm talking about the history of the Equal Rights Amendment is going to emphasize how many people were involved and still are involved. So if you can go on to the next slide. Most folks, when they start thinking about the Equal Rights Amendment or who is involved, they think about NOW, for good reason. So NOW, again, formed in 1966. And what I love about this photo is that these are, this is the beginning of NOW. And if you look at this photo, these are all women who were active, doing the work on gender equality, and then and they gathered together to become NOW. But again, so many folks working on this issue. What's kind of funny to me about the NOW story is that pretty early in the beginning of NOW, the National Women's Party folks, Alice Paul and her group, started sort of infiltrating the NOW meetings, whispering, "Oh, do you want to work on women's issues? What about the Equal Rights Amendment?" And then, by the end of the year, NOW took on the Equal Rights Amendment as one of the central issues that they were going to work on. And within a couple of years, they got frustrated, which is, again, pretty funny, probably to Alice Paul, like, now you're frustrated, it's only been 2 years. But they interrupted a Senate hearing on another constitutional amendment and demanding a hearing on the Equal Rights Amendment. And that was one of the issues, one of the actions that they took that really galvanized public opinion. But meanwhile, if you can go to the next slide, inside of Congress is Representative Martha Griffiths, who is was from Michigan. And she is collecting signatures from her colleagues. So she's got to get a majority of signatures. This is called a discharge petition. You're probably going to be hearing about this more in the future as it relates to our current Congress. But again, people doing the work, collecting signatures, shoe leather, and all that sort of stuff. There are so many people who are working on the Equal Rights Amendment. If you can go to the next slide. Once the Equal Rights Amendment passes out of Congress, which was no easy feat, then we have the ratification effort. I'm going to sort of skip over this part because I'm assuming that most of you as League members, this is the story that you really know. This is the story in the history that you lived, the ratification process and how it started off with gangbusters and then slowed down and sort of stalled for a while. And we're going to skip ahead to 1982. Thank you. So this is Greg Watson. He was a college student. His mother, very active on the Equal Rights Amendment push and heartbroken in 1982. And he had a class in American government, and he wrote a research paper arguing that there were a handful of amendments that hadn't been ratified, and they could still potentially be ratified. And he got a C on the paper, and he was so incensed by this C grade that he took it on as a mission to get a particular amendment ratified. And that amendment was on raises for members of Congress. And he wrote hundreds of legislators, and eventually the amendment was ratified. It's called the Madison Amendment. It's the 27th Amendment, and it proved that time is really not apparently a factor. That amendment, the Madison Amendment, took over 200 years to ratify and was still allowed to be in the Constitution. So if you can go to the next slide, using that precedent, a group of law students who were sort of inspired by their professor, who in turn was inspired by other group of activists, wrote the intellectual underpinning for the three-state strategy. And I have a pullout of all the folks that the students thanked for their help. So again, emphasizing there are so many people working on this issue, even with the understanding that the timeline as it was had expired, people were still keeping a candle lit for the Equal Rights Amendment and still looking for a way and still working for a way. So one lesson I told you about was that it takes many hands, and my next lesson is perseverance and creativity. So this three-state strategy is the legal argument about the timeline, and we're going to get more into the timeline going forward. But if you can go to the next slide, there were activists in states in the 90s, in the 2000s, in the 2010s, working on how to move it forward in unratified states. And one way that one activist decided to highlight the issue was she walked across the country, going through each of the unratified states to garner attention for this issue. And that's a picture of her. Her name is Helene, excuse me. And one of the folks that she connected with during this walk was Nevada State Senator Pat Spearman, and she's the picture in the middle. And as a result of that connection, got the ball rolling in Nevada, and Nevada, after a few years, ratified the Equal Rights Amendment, which was a shock to a bunch of people. And then to others in the community, they were like, finally, yes, we knew that this was a good theory and that this was possible, and Nevada has shown us the way. It's probably not a coincidence that the year that Nevada's legislature was majority female is also the year that they ratified the Equal Rights Amendment. So representation matters. So meanwhile, in Illinois, activists had, again, been pushing. It had gotten close to ratification a few times. Most recent history was 2013. and but just not quite getting it there. So moving ahead to Nevada, Nevada made Illinois more possible, more feasible, more people could visualize it. Also, we had the combined factors of the absolute heartbreak of 2016, the 2016 election, and also the rise of the Me Too movement, and how Me Too in particular was taking fold in Illinois and the Illinois legislatures. There was a series of scandals and sexual harassment scandals, and all of that just was the right combination to build. So my next lessons are, take advantage of those moments in history and those crises to keep moving forward. If you can go to the next slide. So after we had Nevada and Illinois, remember, it's a 3-state strategy. We just need a third, and there were a few candidates for it, everyone pushing hard. And after, I think it was 3, definitely 2, maybe even 4 intense years of campaigning in Virginia, such that like a legislator couldn't leave their house without somebody saying, "What do you think about the Equal Rights Amendment?" So they ratified. So again, our lessons are many hands, that movements have to build and involve so many people, to be persistent and to be ready when those opportunities arise. So that's, actually, I'm sorry, one more history slide, if you can go to the next one. This is where we are in terms of the states. So 38 states have ratified. A handful have purported to rescind their ratifications, and we'll talk more about that. We still have several unratified states, of course, and there are active campaigns to ratify even now. So Utah, Arizona, Missouri a few years ago, Florida for sure, Georgia for sure, North Carolina. There are folks that are still pushing and working very hard on getting their state to join the Equality Club. If you can go to the next slide. So let me share a little bit about the history of the League of Women Voters as it relates to the Equal Rights Amendment. So once it passed out of Congress, the League, of course, was all in. When I say the League, I mean the National League. The state leagues were already working on it. You understand how that works. And then when the 3-state strategy was gaining a momentum, then again, the League affirmed its support of the 3-state strategy in particular. And then most recently, at last year's convention, League members voted to continue pushing hard for recognition of the Equal Rights Amendment as fully ratified. And there are actions. The head of the League is constantly, signing letters, talking about it, bringing it up at meetings. She is definitely your advocate on this issue in Washington, D.C. And there's an activism quote, and thank you, Meg. And then there's another one where you can use it to write your Congress folks, and we'll get to that one too. So if you could go to the next slide. We're going to shift gears now and get into the nitty-gritty a little bit about the legal arguments and what is happening in terms of ratification. So let's start with a refresher on how do we change our Constitution? How does an amendment happen? So as my daughter just learned in 7th grade social studies, Article 5 says there's 2 steps. The first step is that Congress has to propose an amendment, and to propose, it has to pass both chambers by 2/3. Then, after it's passed out of Congress, it goes to the states, and the states need to ratify the text proposed by Congress, and that has to be 3/4 of the legislatures. So if you can go to the next slide. This is a look at what it is that Congress actually passed back in 1972. So you've got here they're repeating that language we just read about 3/4 of the several states, and then they add on within 7 years. Within 7 years. So now the next thing I want you to pay attention to is there's this top part here. It's called the preamble, like the whereases, right? That's where the 7 years is. So here's Congress sort of talking to itself, and then this part in quotes, that is what the states are voting on. So that quote article, blah, 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 section 1, section 2, section 3, that's what states say yes and vote on. So if you look at the state resolutions, that's what they're voting on. So advocates are arguing two things. One, Congress can't change the Constitution this way, meaning Congress can't make it even harder than it already is to amend the Constitution by adding a timeline. Another argument that advocates make is if Congress adds a deadline, they have to put it in the text that the states also vote on. So the idea is Congress by itself can't do it, the states have to agree. So if you look at the text of past amendments, it'll have in the text that states voted on the deadline. And in this case, that is not how they did it. And then the last argument that advocates make is that if Congress can determine the mode of ratification, that Congress can add a deadline, it can also change or remove the deadline. So that last one has the history of Congress tacking on an extra 3 years at one point during our ratification story. So the argument is if they could do that, then they can also just eliminate it entirely. And we're going to get more into what Congress is doing at the moment in a few minutes. So if you can go on to the next slide. I also want to talk about rescissions because that will often be mentioned as a hindrance. Here's why rescissions are not a hindrance. It's not a thing. You can't rescind. Rescinding is a new amendment. That's what we did with prohibition. In the past, states have said, I take it back. And it has had no impact. So 15th Amendment, 14th Amendment, 19th Amendment, states purported to rescind, and it was ignored. So if this time purported rescissions are accepted, then it's wondering, well, what's different? Oh, right, this one's about women. That's my little bias and side comment there. So rescissions, again, not a thing. You can move on to the next slide. I'm going to review what's been happening in terms of litigation. I would say a reminder that litigation in the constitutional amendment process is very normal. It feels messy, it sounds messy, and that's just because we forget that almost every constitutional amendment has been controversial. It's just sort of the nature of our democracy. So after the 19th Amendment, for example, Maryland sued to say, no, Tennessee didn't do it right, to which the Supreme Court was like, get out of here with that noise. We've amended the Constitution, move on. So here are some of the lawsuits that are relating to the Equal Rights Amendment. Around the time of the extension to the timeline, there was a lawsuit that was eventually dismissed as moot because the timeline, it didn't matter anymore because it had passed, and so there hasn't really been a decision on the merits of that case, with the exception of the trial court level. The next case of note is that when it was clear Virginia was going to ratify, 3 states rushed in to enjoin to stop the archivist from certifying that final ratification. And so that case was settled by the Trump administration agreeing not to publish. The next case is a private action case. The folks behind the documentary Equal Means Equal, which if you haven't seen, I recommend it to you. They sued to get the Equal Rights Amendment to be enforced in declared as published, and that case was eventually dismissed for lack of standing. The next case was after Virginia officially ratified. The three final states sued to compel the archivist. So as one state tried to enjoin, the other states tried to compel. So that case went up on appeal, and recently there was a decision on that. So at the district court level, the decision was that the states did not have standing to sue. But at the appellate level, the decision was that the states had not met the burden for mandamus. So the burden for mandamus, forcing a government official to do something, is, as you can imagine, really high. The courts do not like to get involved in telling government officials to do stuff. So it is a high burden. And instead, the panel in that case essentially pointed to Congress to say, Congress, this is something for you to fix. And we'll talk about Congress in a minute. And the last cases of note are filed in state courts. And again, this is another private action case of a group that's suing, I think they're suing state attorney generals for a declaration that the Equal Rights Amendment is enforceable in their state. I'm not entirely clear on that. And those cases are sort of winding through the system right now. So watch this space. If you can go on to the next slide. Now we're going to talk about what is the Equal Rights Amendment and why, again, are so many people dedicating so much time and energy and blood, sweat, and tears on this issue. So to level set, this is the operative clause of the Equal Rights Amendment. That it's a statement of aspiration, really, that are, well, before I get ahead of myself, let's move to the next slide, which is gender discrimination is everywhere. And it is so pervasive in every aspect of our society that we have trouble even noticing it anymore. It's a little bit like, how do you describe water to a fish? It just is. We've just become so almost inoculated to it. So I just want to acknowledge that that truism. So if we could go on to the next slide. So what does the ERA do? What does it mean? Its most basic level, it's an explicit guarantee. It puts in writing what most Americans assume to already be true, but it's not, that the Constitution includes a prohibition against sex discrimination. The Constitution is a reflection of our most cherished values, and as such, it should include an explicit guarantee against sex discrimination. The Equal Rights Amendment is also not only just a principle, but it's an empowerment statement that this is what we believe. We believe that you, Susan, and you, Meg, and you, Sam, and me, AJ, that we are included in the Constitution. You can go to the next slide. It would also bring us up to par with the rest of the world. We are an embarrassing company right now. Most other countries have already taken this step, frankly, because we told them to as the United States, but we haven't done it ourselves. The Equal Rights Amendment is an additional tool to protect against sex-based violence and an additional tool to combat discrimination. If we can go on to the next slide. You will hear people tell you with great confidence that the Equal Rights Amendment is not necessary because the Constitution already protects against sex discrimination. That's not true. So I'm going to give you a very quick look at why this is. Strict scrutiny is the short answer. When a court looks at a law, they they have sort of like 3 modes that they can use. They can review it easy, medium, or hard, essentially. So easy means that the court is going to assume that the government is right, that they can do whatever it is that law that they wrote, that it's fine. It's a pretty easy bar. The government almost always wins on the easy level. I'm going to skip medium because medium it doesn't really exist. It's just not long for this world. And then if we could do hard. So hard is strict scrutiny. Hard is an assumption that the government has to do a pretty careful drafting. So what gets that hard strict scrutiny treatment? So anything in the First Amendment, free speech, religion, press, assembly, that sort of thing. And then also race, because of the 14th Amendment. You will have people tell you that the 14th Amendment also includes women. Sort of, because of grit and spit. Basically, the career of women like Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Polly Murray, and folks like that who did their best to make an argument that it should. But that's just not how it was ever intended. And under this current Supreme Court, it's just not going to stick. That trying to shoehorn women into the 14th Amendment or sex into the 14th Amendment. Even Scalia said it's not going to work, and that's the direction that the court is heading. So that is one of the many reasons why we need the Equal Rights Amendment. Okay, enough of getting in the weeds. If we can go on to the next slide and have some good news. So good news, you in Pennsylvania, you are one of the states that has a state equal rights amendment. You were the wave of the early states that started adding this, and that wave continues to this day. Just last year, Nevada voters approved a state equal rights amendment. A few years before that, it was Delaware. A few years before that, it was Oregon. New York State is scheduled now to have a equality provision added to their state constitution. Folks in Minnesota and Maine are pushing really hard to get that process started for their states, and I am aware of other activists in other states to also to continue that on. And there's an asterisk for 27 because there's some debate as to which states are included on this list. But if folks are interested, I'm happy to provide a list on that. So if we can move on to the next slide. Let's talk about Congress. So you've got the courts pointing to Congress. Activists are also pointing to Congress and frankly also the White House. But we'll talk about Congress today. So there are 2 bills, and you can see from these photos, lots of energy. But if you can move on to the next slide, we're going to talk about the 2 bills that are presently before this Congress. So we've got one in the Senate, one in the House. The text is the same for both. Essentially what it does is affirms what I already know to be true, and I hope you agree with me, that the Equal Rights Amendment is fully ratified. Essentially, the bill blesses that the Equal Rights Amendment is fully ratified. The precedent for this is that that's how Congress handled the last amendment. Remember, we were talking about the Madison Amendment that took over 200 years. Once the last state that was needed ratified, Congress passed a resolution that said, yeah, we agree. So it was just good for clarity, so to speak. So in the Senate right now, we have 52 sponsors. That is a bipartisan mix. And so now, AJ, if there are 100 senators and 52 sponsors, doesn't that mean that it passes? Well, you are, I'm sure, aware that Senate math is not like regular math. So in order to move things in the Senate under current rules, you need 60. So folks are looking at that and looking for a path through that. In the House, we're up to 170 sponsors, and that continues to grow. And here I can take another opportunity to thank you fabulous folks in Pennsylvania. So your legislator, Representative Fitzpatrick, is one of the several sponsors, but he is also currently the lone Republican sponsor. And if I can just take a moment to talk about the role that party has played here. So in Illinois, in Nevada, in Virginia, the Equal Rights Amendment was ratified with bipartisan support. It would not have been successful without bipartisan support. The issue has been bipartisan forever. Just last week, maybe it was 2 weeks ago, in Colorado, their state legislature passed a resolution affirming the Equal Rights Amendment in a bipartisan manner. In the Senate, it passed voice vote unanimously. So again, this is and should be a bipartisan. And so far, Fitzpatrick is holding up his side. So thank you, your senators, and both of your senators are signed on. And thank your representatives who have signed on, and invite those who haven't yet to join the Equality Party. And thank you, Meg, for putting those links in the chat. If we can go on to the next slide. States for the ERA. So I just mentioned Colorado. So far, just this year, there have been a dozen states that have introduced legislation related to the Equal Rights Amendment, either ratifying their state because they haven't ratified yet, or affirming that enough states have ratified the Equal Rights Amendment. And I mentioned that Colorado passed their bill. Last year, California passed theirs. So there is widespread, active state interest in this issue. I also want to mention again the state ERA provisions that have been spreading and growing. And then lastly, I'm going to talk about the state law audit. So that's the project that I'm working on with the ERA Coalition. So the idea there is that states should review their state statutes and regulations to confirm that they affirm with the Equal Rights Amendment. And I'm happy to talk through that process. California is doing a review through their state government. In other states, the review has been led by volunteers. Arizona is an example. They've published theirs. North Carolina legislators recently announced a review that's led by volunteers and supported by some of their legislators. There are a few other states that I know are working on it, but it's not public, so I won't be sharing it here. But just know that this process is ongoing and is an exciting development for the future. If you can go on to the next slide for me, please. So I'm going to end with my contact information. You might have been able to tell that I love this topic. I love talking about this topic. I have a hard time just keeping it narrow and not telling lots of stories. So thank you for indulging me in doing a little bit of story time. I want to encourage you to sign up for updates, to stay updated on this through the ERA Coalition. And I think maybe now do I pass the microphone over to Sue, or is it to you, Meg, to talk about what's going on in Pennsylvania?
To Susan, yeah. Susan, would you like to share, how the League hopes to be involved in this issue going forward?
Absolutely. So I'm active with the director for social policy here. Sorry, let me just correct this. And we have interest in doing what we can to support the eventual publishing of the Equal Rights Amendment at the federal level. We're very proud of the fact that we do have an Equal Rights Amendment here connected to our state constitution, but we do feel responsible for wanting to take some initiative to go further. And so towards that end, I'm actually interested, as part of the Social Policy Committee, in beginning an ad hoc group specifically looking into some of the options that we have for promoting this. And we met, Meg and I met with AJ a few weeks ago and talked about some options, and a couple that, she did mention the state law audit, which is certainly a possibility. But a couple of other things that we have our eye on that we'd be interested in seeing if we could do. One is to get a mention of the Equal Rights Amendment with a passage of legislation that comes through that's relevant to women. So for example, if the governor were to, in making announcement about signing a bill that's related to women, women's health, some kind of women's issue in some way, to also connect it to, make the comment that it's stated to be in accordance with or connected to or true to the Equal Rights Amendment. It further really solidifies the commitment that Pennsylvania has to it. And it could be to the Equal Rights Amendment that we're seeking to get published for the federal constitution, but also can reference the fact that it's in keeping with the state constitution amendment as well. So that's one option. And another option is to encourage the same kind of thing to be done with issues related to women that might get passed through the legislature itself, or to have our legislative representatives come out and speak on this issue as well, and their support of this eventually being passed. So we do have some concrete actions, and there's lots of models of what's taken place in other states, and we are interested in seeing what we can do. And so the Social Policy Committee is looking for a few volunteers to tackle this issue in particular with me and connected to the committee. So towards that end, if anybody is interested in that, I would like to pass along my email. If Meg, maybe you could put my email address into the chat so that folks could feel free to reach out to me. And what I'll do is get back to you, follow up, and then we'll organize and see what kinds of things we can do to get moving with this. We're really hopeful that we'll have your support.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you very much. So we've had some questions come in for AJ during the Q&A portion. Folks in the Zoom, you're welcome to ask additional questions. Use the Q&A to ask. AJ, the first question that we got was just about how do you keep up, on a personal level, your own advocacy? How do you not get burned out? Because this really is such a long and prolonged fight that spanned generations. How do you stay enthusiastic and keep on pushing for this?
Yeah, that's a great question, because it's a real issue. If it's not the Equal Rights Amendment that is, lighting your fire, it's voting rights or something like that, right? So it's the same answer for all of them. So for me, there are a few things going on in my head, right? So one is that I have two kids in school, and I have a daughter and I have a son, and I know that their opportunities are different based on their birth certificate. And that's just not acceptable to me. So that's one. And then, and if I can also share on a personal note, that I am a woman of faith, and my faith tells me that I am equal before my God. And if I'm equal before my God, then I should be equal before my government and the laws. So that for me is a powerful motivator. There's a story in the New Testament, a parable about it's called the persistent widow. It's the parable of the persistent widow. And this woman, she has an injustice. She's a widow, so in that time that meant that she had no rights and very little protection. So she's constantly going to this judge, this corrupt judge, constantly asking him, bugging him. And eventually he gives her what she wants, not because it is just, but because she won't leave him alone. So the parable of the persistent widow keeps me going. And then sometimes I read stories of activists like Alice Paul. There are several good biographies of her. Doris Day is another good one. And I also really like Frances Willard, who's an Illinois person. And again, these are women who just would not stop. So I do get down sometimes, but then something amazing happens, like Colorado and what happened in their legislature related to the Equal Rights Amendment. So there's just always a silver lining. There's always an opportunity. I'm just naturally optimistic.
Thank you, AJ. And thank you for being so vulnerable and sharing why this matters, because at the end of the day, it might seem wonky, but it is about our rights, and it is about the future of our kids and our being as women. So thank you so much for that. That was really wonderful. So this is another great question. So I feel like there's a lot, like as we just shared about, like there's so much emotional reasoning for why we as women want to promote the ERA, but how do you make it really accessible to people who don't necessarily understand what it is? Like, how do you take this wonky thing and just make it really about, is it about rights? You know, is it about your kids? Like, how do you talk about it?
Yeah, for sure. There are lots of different ways to access it. There are different access points. So I remember when I first started talking about the Equal Rights Amendment, I realized that the generation I was talking to would make a difference in how I would frame the issue to connect it to what was important to them. So, for example, if I was talking to my mother's generation, then retirement and equal pay was a big issue for them because they understood how that was playing out in their personal lives. And then if I were talking to women who were childbearing age, talking about family leave policies, like that is something that they understood as being really concrete to their lives. If I was talking to college age students, it was sexual assault on campus and Title IX. Like those were the concrete ways that they could see how sexism was impacting them. So that's usually how I go to it. Politics is personal, and you need to connect it to show people where they fit in that story.
I feel like that's applicable to any policy advocacy, not just this one. Like, how do you make it relatable to folks that are directly impacted by it, no matter who they are? So thanks for that. So how do you, this is another good question about just gender identity and how gender identity fits into this debate, and how do we advocate for the ERA when it really, in a way that uplifts different experiences and is intersectional?
How do we do it? It's true. It is true that it will uplift. So a few years ago, when these questions would come up, it was a lot more theoretical, in that at the time there were cases sort of percolating in the districts and the circuits about how the word sex might apply to sexual orientation and how it might apply to transgender folks. And then we got a pretty clear decision from the Supreme Court. So the legal theory is that if you look at the word sex as including how I expect you to be because you are a woman, then if you are married to a person that I do not expect you as a woman to be married to, another woman, then I am treating you differently because you are a woman, because of your sex. If you come to work and you are not presenting yourself in a way that I expect you to present yourself, then that is discrimination against you because of sex. And this theory did not spring just out of the blue. This was decades of decisions building up to this incredibly logical conclusion that sex discrimination incorporates sexual orientation and transgender issue. And then the other thing I want to touch on is that even though we often frame this as a women's rights issue, gender discrimination cuts both ways, so to speak. So I really think that the first few cases that are going to succeed under the Equal Rights Amendment are going to be requiring paternity leave. Because there's no good reason why all members of the family who are in caregiving roles should not also have the same caregiving burdens, responsibilities, privileges.
Yeah, that's a great point. Susan, I know you had a couple of last questions, and last call for questions, folks, but go ahead, Susan.
Sure. AJ, can you talk with us very specifically about what could a group of people here in Pennsylvania do to support this? You mentioned both of our senators, Fetterman and Casey, have both signed on. Excellent. And we still need some of our representatives. Can we get a list of specifically who has been, who has not? So perhaps in terms of the resolution that's before Congress, perhaps there's something we could work on there. But other than you mentioned the state audit, you mentioned also potentially, well, we talked about a resolution from the governor or the governor making comment of it. What other things specifically could we do that could possibly have an impact on the course of this overall?
Right. About your representatives in Congress, I think that the link that Meg shared, it should go directly to your Pennsylvania folks. I don't have the list memorized, but there's a handful of folks that aren't included. And the shorthand there is, if they're Republican and they're not Fitzpatrick, they're probably not on the list. Yeah. Other thing I would do, is just being.
Okay.
It's not the way it should be. It just is right now. I would also continue to pray for the health of Fetterman and Casey, because I know they have to be in the Senate to vote. So that's very important. Light a candle, say a prayer. I am not joking. It is very important that all of our senators continue to remain healthy. And they will hopefully see that Pennsylvania is a state that wants in its representatives champions for equality.
Okay.
That's the framing I would give it. It is, do you believe in equality? Then you are for this amendment. Do you believe that I am a full person? Then you should vote for this amendment. So it's connecting with folks that they know and care about to deliver this message.
Okay.
So if you are not their representative, it's harder. As the league, you are empowered to do that, is my understanding. So those are sort of the first few places I would go. Supporting all of that is folks don't know this good news. Share the good news. We did it. We ratified the Equal Rights Amendment. It was really hard. And sharing that good news in a time where there's so little good news is uplifting. So there are a ton of ideas of what each league can do in your community, and I'm happy to share those after the call. Those art shows, like Art in a Box, that's pretty easy-ish to do. Movie screenings. I got movie ideas, books. I got a lot of books ideas. So those are other ways to just sort of keep yourselves educated and again spread the good news. Y'all know about letters to the editor. It's tried and true for a reason. Meeting with your representative, even the ones who are our friends, reminding them how important this is, because there are a lot of things competing for their attention.
Okay. Beautiful. Thank you so much, AJ. I appreciate it.
I will add about Pennsylvania in particular. So you have a very robust Equal Rights Amendment, and it's also been heavily litigated. And there's a case right now that's pending before the Supreme Court in Pennsylvania. So keep an eye out for that. And that would be another way to continue to educate Pennsylvania about this issue. So regardless of how that decision goes, it's a opportunity to continue and elevate the conversation.
Got it. That's helpful. Thanks very much.
Well, on that positive note, seems like a good place to conclude. Susan, would you like to offer any final closing remarks?
It's been fascinating to me to both have this conversation today in light of the fact I've been teaching about the ERA in college classes for the last 20 years. And I find that the young women and men who sit in my classrooms are stunned to hear that, read those simple words that is the Equal Rights Amendment, and to find that they have not been simply brought in and made part of the rule of law in the United States. And as I am watching some of the things that are taking place regarding the Me Too movement, regarding issues of domestic violence, regarding issues of marriage and property rights, et cetera, and certainly trafficking, I am continually aware of the importance that the protection of the law is for women, and that seeing this through is an important statement about who we are as a country and the values that we have. And so I'm engaged in this, and I'm fighting for my daughter, for my daughters-in-law, and for my little granddaughter. I hope that you've been moved by some of the words that you've heard tonight, and that you do reach out to us and get a hold of us, and come to work with us on this project. And AJ, I want to thank you so very much, not only for your words tonight, but for the tremendous amount of work you've been doing over the years. I think it's extremely important, and I'm proud of you, and I'm proud to be on the team. So thank you so much.
My pleasure. It takes all of us. We need all of us. Everybody has a role.
All right, everyone. Thank you for joining us, whether you are on Facebook with us or watching this live or later on YouTube. We appreciate your time, and we'll be in touch with some follow-up actions for everyone to take. Have a great evening.
Good night.